I just want to greet everybody, thank RUSI, thank Ambassador Abu Saitov in Almaty. We are looking forward to a productive discussion and to this is our first event with RUSI and hopefully not the last.
With regard to water scarcity, as you said, how would you see that moving forward?
Just an intervention from Ariel Cohen on this.
Oh, right,
Then
okay.
we'll come to you.
Just
So I think you switched it off.
two fingers on the water issue. Ambassador, we read with great concern about the plans by your neighbors to deep south, the Afghan Taliban regime, to build a canal with their technology, not modern technology, not state-of-the-art technology. And that canal, by different estimates, would divert up to 20% of the Amu Darya water flow. In terms of the multi-vector policy, to what extent the Uzbek government, which is the immediate affected party, is cooperating, with Kazakhstan. We saw the delegation of the Taliban regime in Astana at the Astana International Financial Forum several days ago. One of them knocked on my door in the hotel, scared me, but that's a separate conversation. But also, to what extent you can engage the neighbors with whom you have excellent relations, China and Russia, in order to ameliorate and address the illegal activity by the Taliban regime. Thank you. Just two fingers about this. I probably could argue both sides of this case, as you know, a lapsed lawyer I am. One is the strategic minerals are a high priority for the Trump administration. So I'm just thinking aloud, a special fund for mineral development, 50% American, 50% regional, primarily Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, could be an interesting thing for Mr. Trump to unveil. The best opportunity for an American president to visit Central Asia was when Obama was overflying it en route. I don't remember, was it China or India or something like that? And countries in Central Asia, I have firsthand knowledge, begged the White House to make just a stopover and photo op in Astana, and the White House turned them down. The negative now is that one, with 2 rounds of purges at the NSC, I don't know how knowledgeable the current crop of operators are. And 2, I do know firsthand that the White House, the NSC, including the NSC, are really, really, are you allowed to say London pissed off? Yes?
I think now you are.
Miffed, disappointed, severely disappointed with the quasi-legal process, arbitration between the oil majors and one of the governments in the region. And the message I heard was, tell them that until that is resolved, we are not interested in any high-level interaction. So, Wes, after you resolve the $150 billion conflict with the majors, I think we should shift to discussion of President Trump visiting the region. And just, you know, to liven this discussion up, if the Trump organization would build a Trump hotel in Samarkand, I think that would be an additional reason for him to visit the region and, you know, to show up. The latter is not serious.
Or golf course, I guess that works for them.
What's that? The golf course.
Scotland works.
Yeah, yeah.
on
In
golf course.
the Karakum, the famous Karakum golf course, yes.
Okay, I'll just add a few words on.
Quick. On China investing and others don't invest. The matter of fact is, as Comrade Stalin would say, the facts are a stubborn thing. That China has 10 times more, 10 times more in terms of volume of investment than the United States.
Yeah.
So that speaks for itself. Secondly, on our generally gentle analysis of the political risk, I'm back from Astana 10 days ago. I had very high-level conversations, and the conversation in Astana today, behind closed doors, is not if Russia is going to take northern Kazakhstan and possibly the oil in western Kazakhstan, but when and what is the EU, UK, US, and I'm not saying the West because I don't think the West exists still. But what are we doing? How are we strategizing to prevent that from happening? Who are we talking to? What programs do we have, et cetera, et cetera. Notice, yesterday, there was an announcement. The President Tokayev said that Kazakhstan is moving to territorial defense. Do you really think that it just happened in a vacuum? I'll stop here. So, good morning, still morning. I'm Ariel Cohen, the one of the initiators of this wonderful event. Thank you very much to Dr. Melvin for our cooperation. We have two terrific panelists looking at the economic priorities and opportunities in Central Asia and along the Middle Corridor. These are Arzu Abbasova, research analyst at here at RUSI, and my friend and colleague, terrific expert on the region, Dr. Sébastien Pérouse, the research professor of international affairs at GW, George Washington University, and director of Central Asia program there. Sébastien works with us on a number of projects, including on this one. But we have a special treat. The president of ITIC, Daniel Witt, who, like myself, is involved in Central Asia since the early 1990s, happened to be here in London, and I dragged him to say a few words and just kick off this, what I expect to be a terrific panel. Dan?
I thank you, Ariel, and that was way too flattering. A special treat. I would put the cookies as more of a treat than me, but it's a pleasure to be here. We were at the Asta International Forum 2 weeks ago, and it's just amazing. I first arrived in Asta. It moved on Friday, the capital on Friday the 13th. Friday, December 13, 1997. I showed up early February 98. What a terrible place. You couldn't get out of there quick enough. Friday afternoon on those planes, and they were still Kazakh airplanes, was like happy hour, everybody going back to Almaty. But now, at that opening session, I felt like I was in Dubai or Singapore. It's amazing what and I argue with people at the World Bank, they like, so the resource curse. I said, no, the curse are bad people, bad government actors, like in Nigeria. Resources are a blessing if the revenue is managed. Look at Qatar, look at UAE, and so on. And even middle of the road places like Oman. And I just a couple of things to share. I also am honored to be an independent director of the Kazakh holding company, Byturic. and that's the small sister to Samarak Casino with financial assets, a couple agriculture banks, a couple housing banks, the development bank, the Kazakhstan Investment Bank, and they want us to triple the activity there. I'm learning, I never thought I would be learning about spring planting loans, you know, but that's the beauty, you know, even with gray hair, you're still learning. The drive for competitiveness, I wouldn't put it on par of say Singapore or Qatar, but they're not satisfied. You know, I was worried in the late 90s, 2000s. Okay, reform, been there, done that. We're all good. You know, a reform fatigue we saw set in, but now there's a hunger and an appetite. And if you haven't read it, it was reprinted in the Astana Times. It was originally the most comprehensive interview that President Tokayev has done in a year with Al Jazeera. And he talks about pragmatism, but about his vision, but pragmatism and the quest for democracy. And he unequivocally says one term, I will retire in 2029. And he talks about it's about building the institution of the presidency. Now, I think what we have today is possible because Nazarbayev. I mean, you needed the strong leader. I mean, when you think about Astana, what it was and what it is today, that's Nursultan Nazarbayev, no question about it. And a lot of leaders would have buckled. Oh, it's too much. It's, you know, but to be able to stay the course. And that's what Kazakhstan. I first went there in 1993, and our mission was to help them develop a new tax code. And we worked in less than 2 years, and we together, and I emphasize together, we had two computers, one in English, one in Russian. So parallel drafting, so it didn't suffer from poor translation. We wrote a 94-page tax code, and that replaced 56 Soviet-era laws, and it was signed into law by Nazarbayev. Interesting, the parliament was dissolved, but he signed it by decree with the force of law on April 15th. Coincidentally, U.S. tax deadline day. Actually, the day my twins were born, years later. I can't escape the tax bit. Again, that wouldn't have happened if it was a pure democracy, but how on earth do you describe that stuff? So those kind of foundations that he led, but then I was with Ariel a few years back. We were on a presidential observation mission and getting a briefing from KISS, which is a remarkable think tank, Kazakhstan Institute for Strategic Studies. I think it's under the umbrella of the president. And that 62% of the people are under 30. So the challenges of having a young, impatient, spoiled generation, spoiled with internet and the phone and being able to travel abroad and switch on the world on your TV, stuff that we all know 30 years before didn't exist. So I think Tokayev is the right man for the right time to take Kazakhstan to the next generation and build the institution of the presidency. But not to say Nazarbayev didn't build institutions. Look at that central bank with Timur Suleimanov. I mean, that's a world-class institution. It's the digital currency is what really rules. It's a cashless society. Kazakhstan is more advanced with digital transactions than America and indeed the UK. And I continue to be impressed the way they are forward-looking. Tokayev announced a crypto city initiative at AIF. They're developing an AI strategy, and the way the Deputy Minister of Economy described it on the panel I spoke at AIF is that we're not looking just to replace what the bureaucrats do with automation or digitalization, but looking to reinvent the interaction between the state and the citizen. So that type of thinking is remarkably refreshing. And when you think about the US and the UK and how we're kind of struggling to reinvent such a relationship. So it's not just burn and purge, but reinvent. So it's quite refreshing, and it tells me they keep going. And I've said repeatedly, what has got you to this point is open economic policies. You've welcomed investment, you've welcomed trade. And I think that's going forward without any doubt. So the one thing which I would love to see, and I think could be another pillar, this is my last point, and I think the US and the UK and France and Germany as the big daddies, if you will, at the OECD, to push Kazakhstan's membership in the OECD. So I was on the panel with all these OECD people running the Eurasia Directorate, and God knows what they need all these people for in Paris that we're paying for.
It's a nice place.
I mean, it's the ultimate international unaccountable bureaucrat. And they said, well, we're very busy now. We've got a big class. We've got the Balkan countries, and we have Indonesia and Thailand and Argentina and Brazil. And I said, well, you mentioned those countries. I think Kazakhstan is doing pretty well relative to those countries. Well, they've got some issues on democracy, and I didn't want to debate the guy, but I couldn't help but think, look at Thailand, military coups, and the guy promises elections for 5 years, and then they don't seat the person they really want. That's Thailand, but yet they're way ahead Kazakhstan. So I think on the technical baskets, education, health, economic, tax, certainly, they have checked the boxes. So I think our government should really push. That would be a really easy thing, not a big financial ask, but political pressure. And we need to kind of have some people adopt Kazakhstan for the OECD. Remember, Nazarbayev called for this in 2008 in the State of the Nation. So that's kind of economics and political, but I think that could be something that could help really bring Kazakhstan into, a little bit of a safety blanket, if you will. But also, and they take these things very seriously. Look how from day one, Nazarbayev has taken the UN in their obligations seriously. And of course, Tokayev picked that up. So I think that would also be, if we join, we're going to wholeheartedly follow the rules, not like China. We want to be in WTO, and then we're going to ignore half of the requirements. That's it.
Thank you for this opening remarks. Being a wonk as I am, I went to Google and I looked up Indonesia GDP per capita. It's in 2024, 4,960. Okay, it's short of 5,000. How a country with a GDP of 5,000 is going to go to OECD, which is the developed country?
They've got a big
organization.
denominator, and that.
Right. Okay, just say. We have 55 minutes. I'll talk a relatively short conclusion, deliver a short conclusion, and then we can open for discussion. I think we can connect the dots on the strategic uncertainties and vulnerabilities on the one hand, the rise of China, of course, and the aspirations and appetites of Russia as well, geopolitically, which drive the political risk level of Western investment to the point that in some cases it's going to be uncomfortable. However, at the same time, I would argue that our geopolitical concerns should drive our interest in and commitment to investment in that part of the world. So what are the areas of investment that we can address here? We talked about transportation, the corridors, clearly the rail, air travel, fiber optic, and other means of transportation communication. There are companies in the West that can participate in development. Essentially. Second, in the discussion here, I think it's clear that the level of cooperation is going up between the five Central Asian countries, plus eventually Afghanistan, inshallah. And that makes, at least for some companies, the opportunity to look at the region as opposed to individual countries, which increase the attractiveness of the investment. From my travel there, probably from those of you who travel there, we easily recognize that while some achievements in infrastructure development are there, I was very impressed by the high-speed train from Tashkent to Samarkand to Bukhara. I did not get as far as Khiva. I also noted to myself how cheap it is, so I don't know if it's heavily
And
subsidized,
it's
probably
Spanish, not
yes.
Chinese.
It's Spanish. It's a speed that is probably more than twice as fast as what the fastest train in the United States. So 200, the train I was on clicked 247 kilometers an hour. Having said that, we also know from our travel that a lot of infrastructure still desperately needs investment. And I would start with energy. Even in Astana, you get energy interruptions. It's still hot, it's still cold, whatever it is. They definitely are looking to boost energy investment. And they're moving simultaneously in all of the strategy that was attributed to Paris Hilton in 2008. I'm serious, 2008 US presidential election campaign, Paris Hilton challenged John McCain and said she has a better energy strategy, which is all of the above, meaning renewables, nuclear, and fossil fuel. And that's what Central Asians are doing. Kazakhstan had the referendum on nuclear energy renewal after nuclear was brought under control. The Soviet era nuclear was brought under control by President Nazarbayev. They stopped the testing. They dismantled the nuclear arms that were left by the Soviet army, Soviet military on their territory, with a lot of American support, non-Lugar program, etc. But now, on a new stage of development, they are looking at least 2 reactors. The final list of suppliers include the Rosatom, unsurprisingly, the Chinese nuclear corporation, South Koreans, and the French. If I were a betting man, I would say that at least one of the reactors is going to be Russian, and possibly another one would be Chinese, right? Multi-vector policy. And then President Tokayev said he wants some kind of a cooperative effort that would also include other suppliers, probably for equipment around the reactors, transformers, or whatever it is. Central Asia has a huge advantage because they mine for uranium locally. Kazakhstan is a huge supplier, #1 supplier. Uzbekistan doesn't mine as much, but still does mine a certain amount of uranium. And Uzbekistan is now buying small modular reactors, SMRs, from Russia. Is that by itself sufficient to address the energy needs? No. They are also building natural gas fueled power stations. And I absolutely love the solar projects in Uzbekistan funded by the Gulf monarchies or firms from the Gulf. And those projects are marked at 3.5 US cent per kilowatt. That is hugely competitive. Even if you add 30% of storage of batteries, lithium-ion battery storage for these projects, let's say from 3.5 to 4.5, 5 cents a kilowatt. It's highly, highly competitive. And this is why the Arab investors are putting billions of dollars there. Not every place in Central Asia is an Uzbek desert. So this we need to keep in mind. Hydro is in a way a sad story. We mentioned the Ragun, right? Project. It's way over schedule. It's expensive, but the biggest problem with hydro is climate change. As the glaciers shrink, the availability of water declines, and the capacity of hydro in the future may be somewhat limited. And at the same time, a very fast population growth, industrialization, expansion of agriculture all require lots and lots of water. And I'm going to talk about water in a minute. In terms of infrastructure, we saw some flagship airports, Tashkent, Astana. I haven't been in Almaty for a while, but I think the airport is at least adequate, right?
It's new.
It's new.
It's good.
Right. So this is moving on. The airlines get better planes, and this is something both Airbus and Boeing can supply even more. But still, considering the size of the region, they will require a lot of transportation, rolling stock. Some American locomotives are being assembled in Kazakhstan. It's a spin-off of General Electric, but still there's a lot that can be done. And probably if it was my decision, I would love to see both Europeans and Americans doing more and having Russia and China doing less. I think nuclear deserves a separate mention. I already mentioned the large amounts of uranium Kazakhstan is mining and exporting, but they're not moving up the value chain to produce this nuclear reactor assemblies. The Chinese have a small scale production for their own reactors, but beyond that, the ore that is mined in Kazakhstan is put on a train, shipped to Russia, and processed in Russia instead of adding value in country. How that is going to be addressed, given a very sensitive relationship between Moscow and Astana, is a good question. And jumping to the political risk dimension, I think nobody around the table mentioned that over the last 10 years or so, the incessant drip of statements from Moscow, how northern Kazakhstan was originally settled by Russian Cossacks, colonialists, military forts. And then, of course, we know two major things. One, there was both forced and encouraged settlement of millions of Russians on Kazakh and other Central Asian lands. Almaty started as Verny, the Russian fort. Tashkent, when the Russians took Turkestan in 1860s or 1870s, they put the capital in Tashkent, and parts of it were indeed a Russian city. So that rhetoric is encouraged and kept under control in Moscow enough to keep Central Asians on their terms. It's a deliberate intimidation. It's a dimension of psychological warfare. People from Medvedev, the former president, Zhirinovsky, the late rebel rouser, to generals who are chairmen of Duma committees and others, incessantly use revanchist rhetoric to signal to Kazakhs that if they don't toe the line, parts of their territory can be invaded and occupied. So in this context, Kazakhstan making abrupt movements, as they say in Russian, to build an nuclear fuel enrichment supply chain, or buying a reactor that is not an obvious, ex-colonial reactor from Russia or China. I understand the security dynamic around that, but I also understand the Kazakhs are not being pretty good business people, not being stupid. They would like to move up that supply chain, and that brings me to the discussion of strategic minerals. I looked at some of the research that the Kazakhs inherited from the Soviet era. My late father was a Soviet PhD geologist, mostly oil and gas prospector, but not only. He worked in Central Asia. And considering that some of this stuff is 50, 60, 70 years old, that was pretty good geology. But it's 50, 60 years old. Today we have technology, including satellite, including 3D seismics, all kinds of things that can enhance prospecting. That whole thing has its own dynamic because everybody understands that we're talking about billions of dollars of profits, and they tend to hide it and make it secret. So I'm sure that between US and UK, we have enough smart people in business or high levels of the government who can work out avenues for our involvement, or our increased involvement in the preliminary pre-investment evaluation of the natural resources, as well as structuring the investment in such a way that we will not, get a head shave if and when things go south. And they do, as this arbitration suggests. In the ideal world, we would have had joint ventures with the Russians and the Chinese to work on that. Fortunately, we're not in the ideal world anymore, right? We're not in Kansas, as they said in Wizard of Oz. So how can this continue? The Kazakhs, when you go there, are complaining that Americans are not investing. My answer to that is we are not comfortable with mineral rights. We're not comfortable with legal protection of investment. And if you take only the lanthanoids, the 17, what's the 17?
Yeah.
Rare earths, that whole market is $3.5 billion a year. It's very important, it's strategic, it's tiny. When you start adding up other important things, lithium, copper, chromium, these are not technically rare earths. They're strategic elements, but they're not rare. That is a much bigger market. And of course, the Rio Tintos of this world wrote a book about how to invest in that. And I hope and pray that they will be there as well. Finally, my little hobby horse is water. Water, as we mentioned here already, is probably the greatest non-military, non-political strategic limiting factor for the development of Central Asia. With the increase of the population, industrialization, even a project like rare earth development or nuclear development, you need tons and tons of water to process, cool, etc. One thing that is not done and can be done is to move from the Soviet era wasteful technology, be it irrigation canals that are not, the bottoms of them were not paved or covered. So they leak tons of water into the soil through seepage. Be it not using drip irrigation in agriculture. So the numbers I saw in research are talking about 30 to 40% potential saving of water, which is quite significant. Beyond that, doing things like water meters, because in some places they still don't have, people don't pay for the water per gallon or per liter. They have a Soviet style monthly payment. So if, equivalent of $10 a month, that's it. Doesn't matter how much water you consume. That's not good. But I've, got old in the era of USAID. Remember USAID? USAID projects that I evaluated and World Bank projects that everybody wanted to put electricity meters and water meters. Some places they put them, some places they still did put the darn water meters so people pay per their consumption of water. And surprise, surprise, they won't leave these faucets running through the night. But beyond that, there will be a hard limit where to get more water. And hopefully the war in Ukraine will not continue forever. At some point, there will be an opportunity to bring literally hundreds of millions of gallons of water from Russia to Central Asia. This is a Soviet era idea. They didn't do it. If they did it then, it probably would be a bloody mess, as it was with the hydropower in the Volga and other big rivers. We know how much environmental destruction that resulted in. But that's where the water is. That's where they need the water, between the pipes or canals or covered canals, whatever way you do it, that you don't lose too much water. They could bring it from Siberia. If anybody else has better ideas, just don't do what the Taliban is doing on Amu Darya with the canal. I think, again, country like US, country like France, has a lot of knowledge and technology in the water area, and these are also the opportunities. So the opportunities are there. People mentioned the two generations, I would say maybe a generation and a half, who grew up there post-Soviet. The joke I make is, if you want to study business in Central Asia, you go to London Business School, Harvard Business. Oh, they cannot go to Harvard Business School. Forget it, I didn't say that. Wharton, President Trump went to Wharton Business School. They study in the West. If you want to have a career in security, you go to the Frunze Academy in Moscow, or the Dzerzhinsky Red Banner Institute, also in Moscow. So that dichotomy of security in Moscow and business in the West is there, but at least you have the counterparts who studied in the West, and you can speak the same language literally with them about business projects. So I will stop here. We have 35 minutes. Let's open for discussion.
Ariel, just 2 points. One for Sebastian. With the change of president in Kazakhstan, maybe the second ring has been pierced in there is renewed hope for Western mining houses to come into Kazakhstan. I mean, you think about the 90s, and mining companies seem to have a longer memory than investment banks. When you're lied and stolen from, they remember it more than Goldman Sachs, who how many times.
On the project lifetime at 30 years at least, right?
So I know of at least 4 companies that are taking serious looks at Kazakhstan, and you couldn't have said that 3 years ago.
And some of the barbaric things that were done in Uzbekistan under the ancien regime, under Islam Karimov's daughter,
Yes,
in the gold section, were just horrifying. I
Yeah.
mean, people sat with me, told me the stories. I have no reason to doubt the veracity of the stories. And she was just a predator. I mean, this was really bad.
No, Kumtor in Turkestan.
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
So.
but to my question, and again, I don't have, unlike many Americans, I don't have an allergy to China or BRI. I don't want to see a repeat of the Sri Lanka port. Can you imagine China finances a railroad and they go into default? That's scary. You look at the behavior, which I think was wise after Mahathir's party was out in Malaysia. That project was stopped, a rail project financed by BRI. So what, but you know what we haven't heard about is the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. That's a multinational. US is not a member. I think UK is.
Yes.
So it's a multilateral institution. It's not Chinese credit. It's based in Beijing, but it's got a lot of people that have aged out at the World Bank running the procurement and other backroom operations there.
Yeah, if I can share my personal story there, I was in Beijing, I walked into the bank, I had a meeting with a pretty senior official, and I asked her flat out, so does the Central Committee define policy for the Asian Development Bank? And the lady looked me in the eye and said, yes. So that's all I needed to know about it. The question is, the basic assumption, whether the basic assumption is that the West collectively, that I said preliminarily that I don't believe the West collectively exists anymore as of 20th of January. But if the West collectively, if it existed, would end up with a hot war essentially with Russia and China or not, because as long as it's a Cold War and we're allowed to be there and make money there, it's a neutral territory. We had that back, when I was a kid or a teenager in the 60s or the 70s. Some Latin American countries would be a good example, maybe India. So if you think that we're not going to have a kinetic war with Russia and China, then why not invest there? If you think you are, then of course it'll be easy for Russia and China to shut these corridors and to shut, and we saw China does it from time to time, signals that it can shut down the exports of strategic minerals to the West. And they would prevent Central Asia from doing the same, and or the Russians will interrupt the flow of oil to the global markets.
And my point is a bit different in a way. I mean, unlike when you were a child, I mean, the region was divided then very clearly. Now there is a coincidence.
Which region?
Well, I mean, Central Asia and China.
Central Asia was
and Iran.
solidly in the Soviet
Yeah,
sphere.
but now we have China, Russia, and Iran cooperating in opening up this region amongst themselves. Before they were closed borders essentially all across that area, so the region was fractured. Now they're all working to link it up, because, and you can see this on China's energy strategy. I mean, all that they can import over land means they're less vulnerable on the maritime side to blockade by the US. So that's why they want all these pipelines from Turkmenistan and reverse flow from Russia. It means there's less leverage by the US to blockade China on its maritime trade. So but Russia's doing the same. I mean, they're now trying to divert away from European markets. Right. So this space now, they see this as their strategic hinterland. All three of those countries see this as a space where they can build it something outside the reach of Western leverage.
But we just saw, just to be a contrarian here, we just saw how a less than a middle power, a minor power, Ukraine, with the current drone technology, can go and blow up Russian refineries and nodes of infrastructure. So what you're saying is, oh, we're concerned about a situation when we don't have a kinetic war, but at the same time, China and Russia will freeze and prevent these countries from exporting. That is a very narrow band of a political risk environment. Either, like now, they can export, or, God forbid, it becomes kinetic, and then if there is a compelling reason, we can reach out there and blow things up. Right, and when you look at the gray area that Central Asia became, to me, maybe I watched, too many World War II movies and Casablanca and all that. How do you handle the neutrals in a major conflict? If you push too hard, they'll flip, especially a place like Kazakhstan with very strong Russian connection. And as I suggested, ongoing Russian campaign of intimidation. But if you don't do anything, then what's the value of your sanctions? So you play this game. So that's one point. The other point I wanted to make is that Dan and I, and increasingly the West, go in and out of the region for many years. And for the last 20, when we started going there in the 90s, people like Ambassador Bill Courtney, the first US ambassador to Kazakhstan, and others, were involved in big and serious issues like dismantling the Soviet nuclear arsenal, dealing with the bio weapons production in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan was a big center of Soviet bioweapons production. In the last 20 years, you talk to the embassy, all they want to talk about is gay rights or, human rights or something like along these lines. The US diplomacy lost its oomph for big strategic things. And these are hardworking diplomats. I know them personally. I've known them for many, many years. Some of them retired. Some of them stepped down demonstratively now, like Ambassador Rosenblum, because he said he won't work for the Trump administration. Okay. But is there anything beyond human rights that you want to work on, or this is the only thing you want to work on? I'm a human rights campaign baby. I was a Jackson Vanik teenage immigrant out of the Soviet Union. I value and cherish that, but that's not the only thing a country, a power should be engaged in. Sorry.
I agree. I mean, I constantly hear this from the Kazakhstani side about,
What about the UK? Is the UK pretty much in the same?
Yeah, I think because also there's this sort of Soviet legacy that British diplomacy is world class, and then there is a feeling that particularly somewhere like Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan is in a race against time, right?
In terms
of this young population, right?
In terms of what?
It's youth population,
Right.
right? It's got 600,000 people turning 18 every year, and it doesn't have enough jobs. It doesn't have enough
And they won't
electricity,
have
gas,
enough war.
right? And they do feel like, if we go to the Gulf, if we go to China, if we go to Russia, they're talking about infrastructure. They're talking about getting stuff built. Whereas there's a lot of discussion. The decarbonization agenda, for example, is another example of this. Like, they're absolutely willing to engage on it and see it as central. But David, you'll remember this. We had a very successful DIT office in Atyrau.
Yes,
it was doing incredible work.
two people, wonderful.
Two people making a huge amount of money for British business and getting a huge amount of stuff built in Kazakhstan, providing jobs, and we shut it down.
And what?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, it transferred elsewhere, and also the person, the super wonderful person who was in charge for most of the time. Yeah, so
It sounds straight out of this prime minister.
Because
it's-
DIT won't
was-
support any projects that are sort of hydrocarbon
yeah.
based.
Anyway, well, it's a little bit more complicated, but
sorry,
I mean,
I'm
Ariel, you're talking
Mhm.
about human rights and regulation, and this
It's
is
not that I'm
yeah.
against you. I mean,
No,
you
no,
have
no,
to be an
no,
idiot
just-
to be against
just-
human rights, but it's not the only.
No, I was
thing
just going to
in
answer
your
your
brief.
question in terms of UK embassies over the years, because
Right.
I was in most of them. It was difficult in Andeshan days when I was ambassador there to do anything but human rights after the massacre. You know, we were all sent to Coventry. You know, John Burnell and myself and the French couldn't get a meeting for anyone, even a village leader for 9 months. And it took a long time to move out of that sort of thing. But, you know, in Kazakhstan, where I went next, it was all about trade.
Did you overlap with John Herbst?
No,
in
no,
Uzbekistan?
I missed,
I worked with John.
right.
With my
right,
other hat at
right,
that time.
yeah. So
He's a great guy.
yeah, but in Kazakhstan, it was a whole different thing, where it was oil and gas trade, etc. Plus that agenda that it was calibrated. So I think we probably were a little bit more nuanced in those days.
But it's a trend. It's not a specific ambassadorship. It's a trend over time.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm saying.
That
Yeah.
the diplomatic corps sort of divests out of big ticket items and focuses only on that. But that's what I don't have an answer to that.
At the same time, though, I would say, I mean, someone who is focusing on who has, at least in Belgium, primarily focused on a lot of sort of the community level as opposed to the higher, is that the shifts, I mean, I understand some of what you're saying in terms of some of the larger things in growth, but there is a huge and growing gap. I mean, in all of the different countries, and Kazakhstan is no exception. Everyone pretends that there are no problems in Kazakhstan, but no one, like, there's integration issues with the return. There is Western Kazakhstan issues still with that. There are so many of those issues, which, if left unaddressed, I mean, these do then undermine some of the larger, I would say, sort of investments. There is a massively growing levels of inequality, as you say. For example, Uzbekistan is in a race against time, and at least looking also at Russian dynamics, the Russian market cannot absorb, and also they are now pushing back, and there is quite a lot of, at least sending back, of lots of migrant workers. You've got governments in the region who are unwilling to engage with those. They want to try and keep the migrant, at least labor, continuing and not deal with it at home. So I think that at this, I see what you're saying, but at the same time, I think you cannot remove that element of looking, for example, at issues around labor law, around sort of human rights, around the ability to live and work. Essentially, I think that they cannot be I would say that cannot be decoupled in any way. Otherwise, you are looking at, I mean, there will be a tipping point at some point, because
Just to come back on that, yeah, I agree, but that influence and that ability to help shape that, I think, does come from the economic presence. I mean, if you compare, for example, the three major projects in Kazakhstan, you know, in terms of health and safety, in terms of methane and carbon emissions, in terms of corporate social responsibility, in terms of the level of tax paid, localization of supply chains. If you compare that to Aktobe Gas, which is run by CNPC, it's absolutely night and day. And the best way, if we want to promote like a stable economic development in this region, the best way is through, you know, having a strong economic presence there, I think, and helping them develop local capital markets as well, so they're not dependent on, you know, Chinese state development banks for these in-transit bank loans.
So
If I
maybe,
could-
yeah,
Go ahead.
so, yeah,
Thank
please.
you. My name is Claire Priest. I'm from the Foreign Office. I thought I would come back on your point about the focus on human rights, which I think I would disagree with your characterization of the focus on human rights by my colleagues, at least. And if anything, I think we were criticised after Lord Cameron's visit for focusing too heavily on the growth agenda, Russia, Ukraine, and sanctions, and not enough on human rights. So I don't think I'd quite agree with the way you characterised it. But I wanted to ask if you could.
I'm sorry, I was talking about Americans.
Oh,
I was
okay.
not making any I don't know how the British diplomacy operates in the region. I don't have enough exposure.
Yeah.
I always, you know, was very impressed by the accent of the ambassadors.
Well, it counts.
Seriously, I have
No,
nothing to say about it.
I misheard you then. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about what you mentioned earlier on the narratives coming out of Russia from some individuals, at least, around northern Kazakhstan, and also how that links to the sort of decolonization narrative in some countries, especially Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and that kind of very delicate balance and constant recalibration that most of the Central Asian countries have to deal with in terms of their relationship with Russia. And also, I wanted to ask Arzu if you could expand a little bit on your last point around the potential geopolitical shift, and whether you're already seeing any change in approach by the Central Asians in terms of the Middle Corridor, considering the amount of investment, like political, financial, institutional, that would be required to make it a viable route.
You want to start?
Sure, yeah, why not? I mean, I think what we're seeing in terms of the geopolitics in the last year or two, there is a bit of an increased European interest, which we didn't see before. We've seen the summits and so on. I was in Brussels, actually, we were making a presentation on the findings of our colleagues from Brussels. They were like, now we're interested in Central Asia, and to talk to them about, you know, the whole Middle Corridor. But that's how the conversations are based, mostly in terms of and so on. So I think that's the main, you know, actor that we're seeing. In terms of China, I think countries have different perspectives. At least the ones that we talked to had very different perspectives on like how they perceive the Chinese interests. I'll give the example from Azerbaijan. They were a bit more skeptical because they kind of want to keep everything under the control, and they don't want more interest in the country in terms of like the delicate foreign policy that they're trying to balance. They didn't want Chinese investment in the critical, you know, infrastructure stuff. But obviously the same was not in Georgia, where they were seeking for more investment, I would say. But yeah, this would be my two main ones that off the top of my head.
I think you asked absolutely fascinating questions. Maybe for me, because my PhD and my first book were on, it was called Russian Imperialism, Development Crisis. So it looked at the Soviet Union back in the early 90s, which a lot of people didn't. Some did. Hélène Carrère-Dancos, the late French member of Academy of Science, and some others, but a lot of people did not look at the former Soviet Union as the empire. The challenge is that Russia, since Yeltsin went full 180 degrees back to justifying an imperial past. Under Yeltsin, as the Soviet Union was dismantled, they allowed more public space also in the bilateral relations to recognize the imperial nature of the former empire. Now, when I was in Astana and talked to some senior people there, they said, look, we are here having President Tokayev going to Algiers. Algiers is the camp, the Gulag camp, and a memorial site outside of, about 40 clicks outside of Astana, where my family had a very high chance of ending up, my father and my grandmother. But luckily for them, they were whisked out of Almaty. The grandpa was executed and taken to Ukraine. That's a separate story. But said, look, Tokayev is in Algiers commemorating the victims of Stalin's repression, while in Russia, they changed the name of Volgograd airport to Stalingrad. You see the vectors of this multi-vector policy being exactly the opposite, right? Nazarbayev comes and says, we're going to move back to Latin alphabet. We the Kazakhs had the Latin alphabet in 1920s, 30s, before Comrade Stalin imposed Cyrillic. Tokayev comes, gets a cheerful earful from Putin. Not so fast. Let's re-examine, let's check, let's reinvent some letters, because there are 37 Latin letters or something like that. So they put brakes on that. And I say, guys, why is it taking so long when the Uzbeks and before that the Azeris moved to Latin alphabet so quickly, and they say, look at the north, the Russians don't want to learn it, Moscow is pushing, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the issue of territorial integrity is the main issue. And here, to borrow a term from our friends on the left, intersectionality of the Ukraine conflict and the future of the Soviet, post-Soviet empire is absolutely vital. If Putin is successful in Ukraine and is not paying the price, he'll think what else he can grab, be it Kazakhstan, be it Georgia, or something else. If he fails in Ukraine, the chances of Putin going after Kazakhstan, I think, much, much less. And I would invite comments from around the table. I think it boils down to what are the drivers of Putin's legitimacy. He doesn't have elections, and everybody knows elections are fake. Everybody knows elections are fake. So rebuilding the Russian Empire and making Russia great again, right? To paraphrase a slogan from somebody he gets along with, or maybe did get along with. Russia is one of the three great powers now in the world, together with China and the United States. And making Russia great again, meaning Belarus is essentially a Russian province. Grab as much of Ukraine as you possibly can, destroy them if you can, and then shift the balance of power in Europe. Then Russia becomes, I'm trying to remember my Russian European history, when Russia pretty much was dictating terms to the rest of Europe. After the Napoleonic War, maybe, right? Before the 1830s.
Before 1850s.
1830s, 1840s revolutions. And, Catherine the Great was a huge presence as well. That's where Putin is going. And having the internal empire is a big chunk of it. And that's a source of legitimacy. And I don't think it's about writing the history, keeping his place in the history book. It's about here and now. If I'm the one who rebuilt the empire, I'm the one who shifted the balance of power, then you cannot touch me.
Could I just add a quick point on colonialization and decolonialization? I think one thing, if you spend a bit of time, particularly outside of the cities in Kazakhstan, you realize that there's a strong decolonialization narrative around Russia within the cities that's been stimulated by Ukraine. But for many people, particularly in Western Kazakhstan, the colonizers are the United States. And that's been fueled very, very heavily by Russian propaganda, Russian TV.
Right.
So actually, particularly when we're discussing these disputes around the oil and gas projects, for example, there is a strong narrative that the Americans and the Europeans swept in when Kazakhstan was weak, and they colonized and made money out of Kazakhstan. And we need to rebalance this. And the Russians are very, very astute at weaponizing that.
Right.
And there is I was doing a scenario planning session last week in Dubai around this, and there is a scenario where you get a populist uprising in Kazakhstan, a populist president sweeps in 2029 or something like that, and you could imagine something like actually the Russians supporting Kazakh nationalism as a way of going after Western investment in the region. And the Russians can say, look, you run Kazakhstan how you want. You know what our interests are and what we want to see from you. Everything else is. And so we do have to be very careful of the fact that you could see a confluence of Kazakh nationalism and Russian presence in the region coming very hard against.
It's a very interesting idea, and I would argue, having had conversations with Kazakh nationalists, that if something like that emerges, it's essentially a false flag operation.
Yeah.
In other words, they either knowingly somebody is knowingly co-opted and cut a deal, or somebody is played, blind essentially, because I never met a Kazakh nationalist or person who was a self-proclaimed Kazakh nationalist who liked Russia. The forced starvation of the 1920s and 30s among the intelligentsia in Kazakhstan is a very well-known fact, even if they downplay it. That's back to your question about decolonization narrative. They're downplaying the horrible starvation and the population loss of at least 30%, if not more, in the 20s, in forced sedimentation of the Kazakh nomads in the 20s and 30s. They're downplaying the destruction of the Jadidi movement. You heard about Jadidis, right? The Jadidis. So you could easily restructure that narrative and make it very anti-Russian. And among the nationalists, it is present already. You don't need to, work very hard for that. But I think the other scenario, which I think is more realistic, is the Russians got to deal with some general, or KGB, character who is not a nationalist, and say, okay, Bulat, you take over. We give you the guns. We give you the money. This is our list. The Americans and the Westerners are out. That's it. Much easier than a false flag with Kazakh nationalists. Although I won't be surprised if somewhere in the bowels of Lubyanka somebody came. Well, FSB, yeah, FSB. Somebody in bowels of Lubyanka came up with that scenario.
Yeah, I think if the Russians said, look, you get 51% of these projects, no one else is going to ask, who got the 49. I think that's the.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah,
and
and we have Neil. What are the
Unfortunately, we
marching
need to
orders?
finish now, so in the
Yeah.
next sort of 5 minutes,
All
we'll
right.
wrap it up, yeah.
So my impression is that the Central Asian countries are not looking at the US, UK, and Europe as either the return of the Messiah or the 12th Imam. We have a colossal trust problem as a result of our own actions there. And I think one way in which whoever in the West wants to do can help is to ask themselves, well, what is a vital interest of the Central Asian countries at a time of disruption of supply chains? And a vital interest for the five would be to increase intra-regional trade so that they're able to navigate complexities if Europe and China decided that don't trade with each other anymore at some point. So if we're asking for Europe or for the UK, well, what can we do to help? Well, is it an interest for Europe and the UK, perhaps for the US as well, to help China, to help Central Asian countries address strategic objectives for themselves, even if we don't get an immediate return? And that for me would be a first step to show that, well, perhaps the region matters in its own right, and perhaps we're there for the long haul, which we've not done in the past. But I think that in order to answer this question, one question needs to be answered first, which is what does Europe, what does the UK, what does the US want to do with Russia? We don't have a theory of victory over Russia. We don't know what to do. We have a Virgin Mary attitude towards Russia, where we're basically blaming the Central Asian republics for possible evasion of sanctions when we're continuing to trade with it. It's not that Europe has sanctioned anything. Russia has basically sanctioned itself by selling gas somewhere else. Whenever Russia wants to sell, we buy LNG or other forms or indirectly. So I think some questions are just about Central Asia. Other questions have to do with other questions which we're hiding under the carpet, which is, what is it we want to do?
Absolutely. This reminds me, I'm a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. We had closed door meeting with a senior Pentagon official in the Biden administration. This was just a year before they bailed, so November 23. And I asked her, what is the end game with Russia on Ukraine? And she said, we don't have it. And I was shocked, because you're supposed to, when you go to school in second grade, they teach you that when you have a conflict, you have to have at least 3 scenarios, how do you end the conflict? And if, you know, a very senior official could not describe it, or maybe she didn't want to describe it, I don't know. But from everything we know about what Mr. Blinken was saying, what Mr. Sullivan was saying, they didn't really have the concept of it. I said 2 things. What's the end game? How does it look? And second, what is your concept of victory in Ukraine? And she totally like, well, enough said. All right.
You have the wrap-up
famous-
word, actually.
Well, I wrapped it up.
Okay.
I agreed with my colleague
Okay,
from
it
England.
sounds like the consensual way to end our conversation, but